Good day, everyone. Um, my name is Paul Hart. It's a pleasure to be with you. We are going to talk about leading under pressure, particularly in the context of the COVID-19 experience. Let me begin by acknowledging that in a technical way, we are meeting on the land of the Wurundjeri people, since NSOC's located in Melbourne. And let me pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and any elders or emerging leaders or members of other Aboriginal custodians of the land that we are meeting on today. I'm broadcasting this from my home in the Netherlands, so it's relatively early here. I'm also broadcasting this as COVID-19 is at a very different, stage or manifestation than it is in all parts that you are listening from. We're in this kind of dark phase, not just because it's dark outside and winter and cold and nasty, but it's also sort of a darkish phase in the pandemic. Severe lockdowns and those sorts of things. Fear of the so-called British mutation, which is starting to make inroads. So that in itself is telling. We are half a world apart physically, and yet we are in the grip of this same kind of global phenomenon. Yet that global phenomenon manifests itself very differently, different parts of the planet at any given point in time. That's not something that we are used to. I've been studying crises for 35 years. Across different continents, etc. But I've never been in a thing like this, never seen anything like this. So we need a lot of thinking and sense making. So that's what we're going to do today. I would invite you to put questions in the chat or comments, observations. I'll keep it alongside my presentation all the time, and I'll try to keep my eyes on it and engage with questions that pop up along the way. I'll also try and keep some time for you at the end of my talk to ask more questions. I don't think you can actually talk technically, so it has to be pasted in the chat box, and then I'll engage with them. Yeah. Now, what I'm about to share with you is based on pretty intense engagement with COVID response patterns across the world for the last 10 months. As noted before, I've had a past as a kind of crisis researcher, crisis consultant, coming from a public administration background. And when COVID started to happen, this specialization, which I had somewhat abandoned, sort of crept back up on me, both in terms of my curiosity, intellectual curiosity, but also quite a lot of demand for interpretation, sense making, what the hell is going on, etc. So I've been quite active in lecturing, holding webinars like this, but also quite a bit of engagement with Dutch and Swedish, Canadian and Australian agencies, authorities, policymakers, etc. Along the way. And so on the basis of that, and on the basis of literally hundreds of articles that have already started to appear in my field, about the response in Slovakia, Taiwan, whatever. We have my colleagues and I, Arjen Boyne and Alan McConnell from the University of Sydney, have written this book called Governing COVID-19, a crisis management perspective, which we just handed into the publisher. It's going to come out in a couple of months, very quick. Everything happens very quick in this pandemic. So those are our, if you like, collated impressions. So I'm not going to give you the kind of talk that says evidence has shown that. My talk is around, this is what I think I'm seeing, right? So I just wanted to make that qualification, so you know what to expect and what not to expect. Now, without further ado, I'll share my screen with you and walk you through some of those observations. And by the way, that book will come out in open access. It's going to be published by a British publisher, but it's going to be open access. So just watch out for Governing COVID-19 with my name and Arjen Boyne and Alan McConnell in a couple of months, and you can read the whole thing for free. I should share now. I hope that that is now working. I assume that will be the case. Sally, you will tell me if it's not working. Yes, it's working, I'm being told. Great, good. Well, we will, you know, almost inevitably you have to start with acknowledging, I think, the enormity of what has happened. And the enormity is in its global character, in its duration, and I'd say also in the protracted and multifaceted nature of the uncertainty associated with this event. Your normal crisis is defined by three things. Something really threatening or nasty is appearing on the horizon or is already happening, like big shock. That's surrounded with huge uncertainty, and there's a huge sense of urgency. We've got to do something now. But 9 times out of 10, the uncertainty diminishes relatively quickly as a matter of sometimes hours, sometimes days, occasionally weeks. But you know, that's what you figure out, you know, how many people were killed, you control the fire, you conduct an evacuation, etc., etc. And then sort of things start to clear up. And then, you know, bad as things may have been, the crisis moves towards kind of recovery stage, political aftermath, etc. This thing just goes on, as has any other pandemic in history, by the way. If we are lucky enough to be rid of COVID-19 or have it reduced to a kind of, you know, one of the viruses that's floating around, by the end of this year, it will have lasted the best part of 2 years, which would be extremely quick for a global pandemic to be over and to be in control. If you look at history, you're looking at, you know, years and years and years, sometimes decades, with, you know, things disappearing a bit and then coming back. So you know, the time dimension on this, but also the sheer scale of it, which is obviously a function of our globalized way of life, are what makes this kind of unique. Now, given that the long time that it has lasted, let's look a bit at how this thing has morphed over time. What I think I'm seeing is a kind of a strange pattern of a threat that is acute, then because of measures or changing weather patterns, who knows, it becomes more latent. You know, the number of infections goes lower, the curve is quashed, etc., etc. Then it becomes acute again, even in countries like Australia and New Zealand that have basically controlled the thing, because now the aspiration level is to remain in control. You know, just a mere bunch of cases is perceived statewide and by governments as the resurgence of an acute threat, and they act as if there is this acute threat. and very strict measures are being put in place. So even in those countries, it goes up and down and up and down and up and down. Roller coaster nature of threat. Secondly, what is very clear as the economic damage of the punishing social distancing measures, particularly lockdown measures, becomes clearer and clearer, is that we're not just dealing with a disaster, but we're dealing with one of the largest collective active action problems we have ever had. Because this, as you know, the virus is really only badly affecting a relatively small number of the population. And yet we're asking everybody else to sacrifice freedoms, economic prosperity, and a whole range of other things. And to maintain that level of motivation and discipline to do the right thing for a relatively small group, or you could also say on behalf of the larger collective, becomes increasingly problematic. I'll come back to that. Secondly, so in many ways, this is not an event, but it's kind of a chronic crisis, particularly if you take into account that, yes, we may be able to have neutralized, if you like, the public health threat with vaccines by the end of this year. At least in the West, we will not know how long it will take in the global South. But the impact of this economic, social, psychological, across a whole range of parts of society is probably going to outlast the public health impact. So this crisis will last longer than 2 years in many regards, and for many of you in terms of your responsibilities. So it has become a multi-crisis, one which touches all of us, still does, but which is becoming and will become more and more about what it is revealing in terms of underlying inequalities of opportunity, etc., that are exacerbated by this crisis. Personally, I'm very concerned about how this crisis is affecting the young, working with students, but also sitting on board of a group of schools, etc. I see it fairly close up, and you can just, see the damage that's being done, and that damage doesn't hit randomly, let's say. So from a kind of social policy point of view, social justice point of view, we still got quite a bit coming, I think. So you have cumulative complexity and increasing controversy over time. Now let me pick out a couple of things that I think are particularly challenging. Then I'll come to the kind of the leadership aspects of this, and then I've got a bunch of potential lessons to be learned to increase our resilience for this type of mega crisis. That's going to be sort of the structure of the talk. So firstly, as I mentioned, there is this kind of protracted uncertainty. Most governments have responded to that, certainly initially, but in a way systematically by listening to certain forms of scientific expertise in a way that they normally don't. We've all seen that. The guy in the middle on the tattooed guy on the arm there, believe it or not, is the chief medical officer of Sweden, Anders Tegnell, who became such a cult hero in Sweden on the wings of him being presented as the guy who knows what to do by the government. The Swedish government has gone much further than Australian and the New Zealand government in sort of pushing its leading government expert to the front of the stage. In fact, the Prime Minister has taken very much a backseat approach, almost to the point of invisibility. Health minister somewhere in between, but the main guy, the main person being seen to be leading the Swedish response has been the chief medical officer. And indeed, in many countries, they have shot to prominence as a kind of a co-equal. And usually behind them, there is a pack of medical experts. In Holland, we have a team which started off as only, virologists and related medical disciplines, but has now swollen to include behavioral scientists, social scientists, economists, etc. And they are basically the in-house advisory unit for the cabinet, advising them, making both written and verbal advice on a weekly basis. Yet the questions that get thrown at them keep coming. They just keep coming, not just related to COVID-19 behavior, but also to, if you like, the behavioral impacts in society, economic impacts in society, etc. If ever a group will be exhausted from the effect of being in such a prominent role in a crisis, it will be them, I think. Fireys are used to weeks and weeks. These guys are going at the pace of fireys, and they've been going for 10 months now. Secondly, you see this shift in public mood. Not everybody's protesting, etc., but particularly here in the second wave in Europe, which is about to turn into a third wave on account of the British mutation, you can see it chipping away at people's motivation to do the right thing in this big collective action problem. And you see a small but very vocal group, and growing, I think, group, no longer buying the government's story of discipline, sacrifice, etc. And the loony fringe of that group is not even buying the story that something really bad is going on. In fact, we had a big demonstration in Amsterdam, which turned into riots last Sunday, and somebody held a self-confessed medical practitioner. He was a guy who actually did have or does have a medical degree, but does not actually practice. But he presented himself as a doctor, and he proceeded to say that C-19 is a hoax. All those people in hospitals are actors, etc., etc., etc. So the stress and the deprivation, the protracted uncertainty is certainly getting to people. Particularly people, obviously, in sectors, economic sectors that get hit so hard. And we're beginning to see this, and we've been seeing this for quite a while. So that this health threat is actually impacting in the veins of society, not just in the economic veins, but increasingly in the social veins. So while we are quashing infection curves, there's all these other curves developing, and they go perhaps up and down, or they go just up and up and up, but they are something to watch. So take, for example, domestic violence. During the first lockdown, that was actually, the official stats didn't see this sort of big increase. There was a lot of questions being asked. Okay, is this because of underreporting? You're locked up with the perpetrator. How the hell can you report? There were all kinds of attempts to make it easier to report. But the numbers didn't really get up all that much in many jurisdictions that I'm aware of. That is quite different in this kind of second wave. They're going up very markedly, and apparently people are able to find their way. So it goes to show that the second lockdown is not, and I'm sure it was the same in Victoria when they had it. It's not just a repetition of the first. It stands on the shoulders of the first psychologically in terms of mental health, etc. So things start to add up clearly. And because things start to add up in the economic and in the social space, those themselves become politically consequential, as you can imagine. And the words in red I think can all be related. So are relatable. So take, for example, the issue of blame. In Victoria, New South Wales, for example, and even in New Zealand, you had inquiries. In Australia were very public, sort of Royal Commission style inquiries. New Zealand was more like top public servants. But there were sort of inquiries into breaches of quarantine regimes, etc. And the Ruby Princess inquiry in New South Wales, and so you have an active life crisis. You're still responding, and yet the dynamics of accountability, blame, and learning are already ongoing. The same goes for the level of trust. We've seen in most countries that were, let's say countries that were not run by madmen, you saw the rally around the flag effect, which has by and large sustained quite a few governments. I'm sure that Scott Morrison was pleasantly surprised to see that in this crisis, nobody seemed to remember or care about the bungled response to the fires, which had occurred only a couple of months before. People were sort of in the here and now of this massive threat, and they were liking what they saw government doing, and they were liking, what perhaps his personal appearance during this crisis. And a lot of populations have held pretty firm through the ups and downs of this. A lot of governments still are in a kind of a net gain space. I recently saw a statistic, they did like 40 countries, they did a comparison of levels of trust over time in the pandemic. And what you could see is that in the last 4 months of the pandemic, there was only a small number of countries which had very specific response problems where trust had gone down from what it had accumulated in the first 5 months of the pandemic. So trust holds firm, which is very interesting and relatively atypical in crises. What we're still sort of bracing for is what is this? How are the curves of public spending going to evolve? A lot of rich countries are throwing everything in the kitchen sink at this, economically speaking. We're incurring massive debt because of this. And a few of the OECD countries have stopped this pattern. So they're still busy throwing parts of the kitchen sink at the problem. But all of them are running out of parts. So the question is, when will we move from a big spending to a consolidation / retrenchment regime? And how will that, in terms of timing, coincide with spending needs on, let's say, social and economic impact mitigation, even post-virus? We don't know, but I'm not that hopeful that we are going to kind of be rid of many of the social problems triggered by COVID. Also, the delayed health impacts on the health system, which is now prioritizing COVID cases. I think that could go on for quite a while, and I'm not sure whether there'll be enough money around to let's say a year from now or 18 months from now to deal with those problems in, let's say, maximum or the usual fashion. I did see, I got notification of a raised hand, and then it went away, but I think it was somebody called Jess. Jess, if you have a question, please put it in the chat. how do we see the response of this crisis, the response to this crisis morphing? What is the, if you like, the method to the madness or the emerging pattern as we move from, if you like, acute crisis response gradually towards, governing after an acute threat? We're not there yet, but we, are foreseeably there, and to some extent, although they still have to remain very vigilant, Australia and New Zealand are in a way, or in some areas, already in that kind of post-acute stage. So this I've talked about, so I'm not going to repeat that. What we also see structurally is that we saw this in Europe, for example, in the Northern Hemisphere over summer, when the first wave was squashed. A lot of governments responded by taking down their crisis response structures and putting the handling of the crisis back into, if you like, the normal channels of government, which is what you tend to get during disaster recovery periods. And usually that means that, what once was a carefully orchestrated, tightly run, top-down coordinated show became a more loosely coupled and sometimes, more competitive kind of bureaucratic politics space. We certainly got that here in the Netherlands. Here, over summer, the crisis response was basically handed back to what we call the safety region, so basically subnational government. And then when the second wave hit, they couldn't handle it. The thing had to be re-centralized, and already weary and exhausted departmental bureaucrats and health agency bureaucrats had to again go into crisis mode. So you get this kind of up and down in the structure of the response as well. Thirdly, as we will move towards the end of the acute sort of pandemic phase in this crisis, you'll see a gradual return, and that's already in a way starting to happen. You'll see less deference to the executive, and you'll see a return of monitorial democracy as usual. So the checks and balances, the inquiries, the criticisms, etc., will grow and grow and grow. And it'll become harder and harder and harder to appeal to the crisis of the moment to do something really controversial. So it'll be back to a more negotiated form of democratic politics. And the prominence of experts or particular, government experts will decline. There's no doubt about that. There'll be a more overt competition between different types of expertise. As the social and economic issues start to eclipse the acute medical issues, you'll see a shift in the, if you like, expertocratic landscape, I think. Okay, what are some leadership challenges out of this crisis? Well, this one I could have put in for any crisis, of course. There are certain really stupid things to do when you're in the middle of a crisis. I've put them on the sheet. None of them should be particularly surprising. What is perhaps surprising that some leaders of some pretty big countries committed most of these known pathologies. You also see a picture of the Bush government in there. I've put that in as an illustration of groupthink. The way they handled Iraq was very much evidence of, a relatively small, relatively closely knit group that had kind of sealed itself off from independent sources of advice or all forms of advice that didn't agree with their, if you like, beliefs about what the problem was and what needed to be done about it. And I'm highlighting this because there is one insidious risk of the long duration of this crisis. That is what we call bunker syndrome, where you've got basically essentially the same group of core officials, whether it's at the level of an agency, you know, the crisis team and agency blah, or at the level of cabinet, the core cabinet ministers and their core circle of in-house experts. Everything we know about groupthink, which is a term for a propensity for excessive concurrence seeking. So basically not raising any doubts, personal doubts you may have because of your loyalty to the team. In such a protracted crisis, if you've got the same group essentially running things or running the response, there is that danger of tunnel vision, bunker syndrome, which de facto means groupthink. So one thing to think about is ways of refreshing that group, having backup people, diversifying the advisory flow, bringing in a facilitator, a process manager that sort of teases, that keeps everybody on their toes so that they don't start taking everything for granted. There's also this issue of myopia. I've been pretty close, very close, too close for comfort, to the response of the Dutch health ministry. My wife is a senior leader in that department, so I've seen her work 12 hours a day, 12 to 15 hours a day for the last 10 months with 1 or 2 short breaks. And what happens to people like that is that getting through the week becomes, you know, the only thing you can do or you think you can do. There's so much to take care of that happens in real time, particularly as the circle of briefing ministers, preparing for press conferences, then preparing for parliamentary debates, then dealing with the fallout of all of that in your stakeholder environment. You know, that's kind of an ongoing short cyclical rhythm. And the long game, the thinking about where will this crisis be 2 months from now, 6 months from now, you know, that's in every handbook of crisis management, being recommended, do this so that you maintain a strategic view of this, that you have multiple possible scenarios for the future stage of this crisis somehow in your mind. I could just see them losing that ability along the way. And I suspect that there'll be many people working in agencies where exactly the same has happened. Which means that you condemn yourself to a reactive mode of thinking. And really, I respect how busy people are, but for me, it's very hard to understand why even large agencies where you've got, yes, you have hundreds, sometimes thousands of people working on this crisis full time, and yet you have many more of them basically sitting around doing, in some cases, less than they had to do before because, you know, their issues are all put on the back burner. Surely there must be redundant capacity in there somewhere to be found to be able to form a team that focuses on this kind of what if thinking, scenario thinking, and gets access to, if you like, the crisis core, the crisis response core group every now and then to break through that myopia, to break through that 100% reactive mode. But if people have examples of that to share, I'd love to see them. And because you're in this kind of reactive mode, because the stakes are so high, there is this threat or risk of what I call entrapment, rigid adherence to your initial policies. So the leadership challenge is to dodge those pathologies, and if you like, the meta leadership challenge is to continually observe your own process, to sort of get on the balcony of your own group or your own organization, your own section's dynamics. I see Lucinda Rex saying that she agrees with this myopia comment. So clearly that is resonating, at least with her. Second big challenge is everybody is just tired. tired. That's the word I hear all the time when I'm asking around, how are you going? Everybody's saying, I'm sort of okay, but I'm just so tired. And this fatigue is not just a characteristic of these individuals. It now becomes an organizational, almost institutional characteristic that has to be navigated. Fatigue as a sort of a big HR issue within this crisis, if you like. And it has to be attended because it is a crucial make or break factor in organizational resilience. The ability for people to see pathways out of this, you know, the light at the end of a dark and curvy tunnel. People need to find reasons to believe. All those things we know from the resilience literature, etc., psychological literature. But we also know that there is this performance curve, you know, that a bit of stress is great. We actually do better. But if stress becomes too high or lasts too long, performance goes down. And I have seen examples close up, I will not go into detail, of ministers and very senior public officials that were clearly on the downward slope of this curve. But nobody was talking about it. It was not being called, and they themselves were unaware of it. And sometimes it has led to, personally and in one or two instances, politically or reputationally painful incidents and then corrections, if you know what I mean. So who can kind of sit removed from this and observe key players and look after their mental well-being in the way in which more specialized crisis agencies like, you know, police or fire, etc., they are much more used to dealing with this, and they have more discipline in you know, people's rostering and so on and so forth. Whereas those policy bureaucrats, they don't have that type of tradition and discipline, and I think they're starting to pay for it in this kind of, you know, second year of the crisis. We see the return of politics everywhere, accountability politics, the politics of learning, about which I'll talk more. But increasingly we are turning our minds, or we should be turning our minds, to what does this crisis enable in terms of innovation, reform, etc. People are not only sort of desperate for any positives to come out of this crisis, we can also see, you know, opportunities. If we do manage to change work-life rhythms and routines, commuting patterns change, this has implications for transport policy, this has potential implications for air quality, for all kinds of environmental outcomes, etc. There's all these kinds of if then change that exist and that people are warming up to explore and to further, whether it's distance education, e-health, etc. And so there'll be a politics of reforms coming out of this. At the moment, it's mainly think tanks throwing reports at us, and maybe strategy units sort of, you know, holding out carrots. But pretty soon, I think during this calendar year, that reform politics will heat up. Vested interests will certainly be protective, etc., etc. So we are about to enter a very interesting period, I think, that we see after many crises. You know, normally there's the inquiry, the government says, okay, we're going to accept all these recommendations, and then you get, like, you know, 50 groups of public servants all working on recommendation 1.3, etc. I think this one will be different. There will be that, and there will be a larger kind of politics of seizing the moment, innovation, etc., etc. So there is this question that leaders need to face as we move towards the if you like, end game of the pandemic phase of this crisis. What do we keep? What do we continue? What do we do more of? And where do we really need, or where have we been given an opportunity to innovate? All in view of the fact, communicated so effectively on that little cartoon at the bottom, that, you know, yes, this is a big crisis, but we already know we are heading for 2 more huge crises. And I note Sue's comments about nourishing yourself and your team. And if you abandon that, Sue, you know, your level of resilience will go down, and everybody will notice, and that can have catch-on effect. So I totally agree with this comment. But in my experience, it is very, very hard to, as an advisor, to actually make that point. You can make that point once people will kind of notice and say, yes, you're right, but not right now. I'm too busy. You're making it twice. They're saying, you know, piss off, don't disturb me, I'm busy. You make it a 3rd time, you know, another month has lapsed, and you can see people sort of wearing themselves out. And when you knock on the door a 3rd time, you know, they won't even let you in. That's been my personal experience anyway. So it is very, very hard to get people out of that kind of bunker mentality, that heroic kind of, if only I put in these extra hours, you know, I'm somehow a good leader, kind of pathology. So if in the last part of the lecture, I wanted to talk about this kind of 4th leadership challenge, to make sure that we not only kill the virus and, you know, save jobs, etc., but that we also manage this crisis reflectively and ask the question, what does this crisis reveal? And think about this question so as to inform our discussions about reform, innovation, consolidation, etc. So what are some of the things we might be thinking of? Well, at a very high level, we can think about our way of life, you know, our globalized economy, which will mean that any other, you know, nasty virus that comes around will spread very quickly and more widely than ever before. Another sort of way of life thing that became apparent very early on in the crisis was that an alarming percentage of the world's pharmaceutical products are made at a very limited number of medical campuses, production facilities, mostly located in places like India and China. Is that something we want? There's many other scenarios that we can think of where this would not be a great idea, and so on and so forth. So there are these kind of deep systemic questions that emerge. There are obviously questions to be asked, some pretty important questions around how well were we prepared for this type of mega crisis, a global pandemic. If you would have asked this question even in February 2020, or maybe January 2020, you'd get a moderately positive response. People would point out to all these other, you know, recent, relatively recent mini pandemics, Ebola, SARS, etc. And a lot of people would have said, you know, we know how to nip these things in the bud. And I've done a bit of a study of pandemic plans here in the Netherlands at the sort of subnational and national level. And it is shocking to see the kind of assumptions that were built into these plans. They were all far too benign about the kind of virus that they were planning for, the behavior of that type of virus, and about, if you like, our resourcefulness in isolating it, controlling it, etc., etc. And what goes for pandemic preparedness goes for preparedness or for a whole range of other crises as well. And the question is whether we increase that preparedness by producing new paper or whether we need to think more about contingency planning in other terms. I see comments coming in. I see Goran saying, in terms of economic influence of this pandemic, I see a shift in industries and focus on technologies that enable and support commercial recovery. That's inevitable, etc. Yeah, so we see basically the creative destruction of capitalism undergoing the effects of this crisis. So some industries are losing greatly, and others have a tremendous opportunity for growth and innovation, which then obviously has consequences, macroeconomic consequences, but also regulatory implications for government, etc. Catherine is commenting on the preparedness issue, saying we were as ready as we could have, but we may not have had the right leaders. Yeah, look, that's a tragic situation to be in, Catherine. You know, the systems are okay, but the people calling the shots are perhaps less suited to the task. And there's many reasons for what, how this can occur, obviously. Pretty delicate situation to be in, because it basically means you have to replace leaders. In Holland, we had the odd luck that one of the leaders in a way replaced themselves. Our health minister physically collapsed in parliament 10 days into the pandemic and had to be replaced. So people working under him probably, though they liked the guy and he'd been a good health minister, but he was clearly not a crisis manager, crisis leader. And so, you know, he circulated because of natural causes, let's say, but you know, the odds of that happening are not all that big. So sometimes you have to labor under people that you wonder about. And Cater is saying there's these conversations about the new normal to the next normal. Yes, and there's some naivete in these conversations as well, as if a new or a next normal will appear in some sort of linear fashion. And we cannot afford this naivete. Unless we really work at it, people will start going back, wanting to go back to their offices, 4 or 5 days a week, or managers are requiring them to be present 5 days a week, etc. And one of those potential huge advantages of the new crisis experience is going to be neutralized. So in other words, we need to be really strategic in what we want to see come out of this, what we want to avoid see come out of this long term. And it's all the more important to get thinking power, thinking energy mobilized to help you do that. Thirdly, what is our capacity to improvise when the rule book is useless? And in any real crisis, the rule book tends to be useless or of limited use. Let me be a bit more respectful about the rule book. Have we got our theories in use, our firmly held beliefs about how the public responds to a crisis, to stress, to threats, etc.? Have we got it right? There's this long-standing myth that the public will panic. And yes, we saw a bit of panic buying and the early stages of lockdowns, etc. But by and large, public behavior has been remarkably rational, remarkably disciplined, etc. And what can we learn from that observation about the assumptions we are making about public behavior and the public's ability to deal with bad news for other crisis or disaster scenarios? And what are we learning about our capacity to actually seize the moment in a crisis, to forge innovation, etc.? So I'm winding up my talk with 5 pathways to resilience. They're the concluding chapter in this book of ours. And they're pretty tentative. But to me, it's clear that looking at the state of our preparedness for this type of event, certainly in some countries, it took a hell of a lot of time before they really saw what was before them in this pandemic. the months of December and January will be very intensely studied. What happened there? Why did we need to have, domestic cases spinning out of control before this was really being treated as a crisis? Certainly, I'm talking here about Western Europe. My sense is that Australia and New Zealand were given some time to observe the mayhem in countries like Italy, or were given this kind of handed the ambiguous gift of an early stuff up like the Ruby Princess to then sort of get very serious very quickly. But there is this sense of organized blindness for really, really bad cases that is just there. It's very, very difficult to be a Cassandra on any given kind of scenario, unless you're operating in an environment of high reliability organizations, which you see pictured on the right-hand side of the screen. There are organizations or systems, whether it's the power grid or whether it's aircraft carriers or some elements of the chemical or process industry, where they've got this sort of culture of taking even the most minute and seemingly unlikely low probability, high impact scenario very, very seriously, and therefore putting themselves in a better position to curb it before it gets out of hand. Secondly, I think there's a lot to be said about the role of experts and expertise in many cases, or in many respects. This pandemic has been, in quite a few countries, if you like, a model of politicians letting expertise and science into their policy making. But I've also seen cases of remarkable imbalance in that expertise, a kind of a predominance of a narrow bandwidth of experts, influencing decision making, clearly leading to blind spots or unawareness of the real trade-offs of decisions that were being made on the part of policymakers because they weren't listening to other experts. So the predominance of epidemiological, virological expertise, and certainly in the early stages of the crisis, I found concerning, given the fact that we were not just in a public health crisis, but we were in a massive collective action problem. I see questions coming in or observations. Catherine saying Australia obviously has a lot of disaster experience, due to its sort of geography and weather patterns, etc. That may be true. Yet, there was a big stuff up just months before the pandemic. Maybe the federal government was so up, on its toes in this pandemic because it had stuffed up, the previous big weather event response. You never know. My long experience is that you need recent exposure to a crisis for that kind of thing to work. I think one of the reasons we were a bit less agile in this public health scenario was because there had been quite a few of those viruses that were kind of that never left East Asia. SARS jumped over to Canada, but that was just about it, and that was because there were a lot of Chinese in Toronto and in Vancouver. And Ebola stayed in Africa and so on. So there was this kind of, too easy assumption because a truly global pandemic had only happened 100 years before, not 3 or 4 years before. Number 3, clearly there were some remarkable practices of holistic governance, collaborative approaches. A national cabinet, I think, is a good example of a federal system which normally has big difficulties joining the dots, so to say, across the jurisdictions, making a pretty heroic effort at the very senior level to overcome sort of coag pathologies and get the business of the country done. I'm waiting for studies of the comparative performance of different federal systems, because clearly things were a lot less good in the United States, to say it euphemistically. I think Canada is somewhere in between. There were more issues in Canada than there were in Australia. It's never easy, and there were conflicts. I'm aware of all of that, but by and large, there was quite effective boundary spanning, as we call it, a deliberate effort to organize across boundaries, to organize interdependency in responses across jurisdictional, sectoral boundaries. And that's exactly what we need. And in my 35 years, I've seen a lot of cases where that has happened. In this crisis, I see quite a few, an encouraging number of instances where they do better, and I hope we can learn from that. Fourthly, I think Jacinda Ardern and co have given all of us, the entire world, a kind of a masterclass in dominating the narrative of a long ongoing crisis. The use of the full array of media channels, the adjustment of message performance to the kind of format you have, has meant that basically her government has been able to dominate the frame, the public discussion frame, the media frame, etc. Whereas in most other countries, I'm not too sure about Australia, there were, I think, ups and downs, but certainly in most of Western Europe, and certainly in the Americas, governments completely lost control of the frame, either because they stopped talking for months when the virus seemed to be under control, at least temporarily under control, or because they were, bad in their messaging. They approached social media in far too conventional a fashion, etc., etc. So there is a lot to be learned, and the framing contest is still going on. The framing contest, between the virus skeptics, etc., between certainly now the anti-vaxxers, and there'll be a framing contest about how could all of this have happened in the first place, etc. So there's many lessons to be learned about effective crisis communication, and if it were up to me, I would start in New Zealand to learn those lessons. And then finally, there is this notion that ultimately, no matter what the agent of threat, ultimately a crisis becomes a crisis and remains a crisis because of the presence of collective stress. Rather than focusing all our efforts on the technical work of, kickstarting an economy that is kind of jolted or needs jolting, etc., all of that needs to be done, but that's not ultimately the essence. The essence needs to be what is this doing to the well-being and the sense of safety and security across our entire population. And there's no doubt that we, moving forward, will need to draw on reserves of empathy and deep understanding of things like grief cycles and so on. That is normally only, that type of awareness is normally only present in, let's say, the social policy sphere, in parts of the emergency services, etc. Whereas now the education system will have to deal with this. Tough environments like hospitals will need to deal with this, if only because of their staff will go through this. There'll be a lot of post-traumatic stress across the community, but also among the first responders. So I think we will need to step up and spread well-known knowledge that is out there and well-known repertoires for being empathetic and working through these kind of grief cycles and working through collective stress. But the knowledge of that has to be spread to places where it isn't normally required across the public sector, it seems to me. So I am looking at the clock. I've gone 1 or 2 minutes over time. So here is kind of the summary of these kind of 5 high-level pathways to resilience. Is it comprehensive? No, of course not. But I hope I've persuaded you that each of them is worth attending to in some way as you move from being preoccupied by the response and start to make time to reflect on what does this crisis teach us and how can we increase the sophistication of our preparedness and our response and our recovery in the future. So I'll leave you with this. If you have gotten curious, there is these two older books, but I would point your attention to the new one, because that is really written in the context of COVID. It's coming out. It will be for free. Just make a mental note in your diaries or something to look it up by. I'd say sometime in April. It will be around on the web. I hope this was useful. I wish you all the best in this series, but also in your work and your life. And let's hope that when we meet again, who knows, maybe a year from now, when you sign up for some other ANZOC thing, that we will be in an ongoing process of learning, but at least we will have in the famous and notorious saying of the chairman of BP in the Louisiana oil spill, that we have our lives back. I wish for all of us to have our lives back a year from now. Let's see how we go. All the best, and thanks very much from here, from Holland. I hope to be back in Australia, hopefully even this calendar year. It has pained me that I wasn't there in 2020. I hope to be able to be back and meet some of you face to face in 2021. Bye-bye.